have three different data points that we look at in the accountability team to determine who the EL students are. The first is by looking at their AZELA test or their test history, and you can see that in the EL 70 report. The second is the EL student need, which you can see in the EL 73 report. The third is their EL program participation. Combined, all of these data points tell us not only the current status of each of the EL students, but also their history as well. We've had some challenges in identifying EL students in the current year, and these challenges started last year when the lockdowns took place in March. So at that time, we had 95% of the AZELA reassessments taken prior to the lockdowns. So testing was not completed for everyone, but we do know the performance level, the AZELA performance level for most of the EL students from last year. In this year, we have a decline in placement testing overall. So we don't have placement tests for all of the new EL students the way that we typically would. Also, the AZELA reassessment window has been extended to May 21st, and so reassessments are still ongoing. And at this point, we don't have all of the test data for each of the students. And the EL need identifier or EL need status is determined by the test history and whether or not the student is enrolled in a program. So the EL need status or EL need identifier might not be accurate for all of the EL students, especially if, for example, they didn't take a placement test. And we can still identify, for the most part, who all of the EL students are based on their program enrollment. However, that EL need indicator is a very important one for federal and state accountability. And because everything is still in flux, everything is still playing out in the current year, we will be re-examining all of these indicators when the final data is in at the end of July to look at what data is still missing or incomplete. So looking now at EL program participation, from what I can see as of about last week, maybe the beginning of last week, we currently have about 86,000 EL students who are currently participating in a program. About 67,000 of those are continuing in a program from last year, not necessarily the same program, but they are continuing EL students. And that's about 78%. Approximately 19,000 of these EL students are new this year. So that's about 22%. Of these new EL students, I can see that about 60% of them are kindergartners, and about 60% of them look like they have a placement test early in the year. And I don't have any of the testing outcomes yet, but I can see that there was a test administration date. And just FYI, about 4% of these EL students have switched programs throughout the year. So there's a little bit of mobility in the programs. And also about 2% of the current students with an identified EL need were in a program last year, but they're not in a program this year. And all of these counts do include the parent withdrawals. So let's look a little more closely at those program participations. Of the 86,000 currently enrolled EL students participating in a program, I can see approximately just over half of them are in the A1 pullout model. About a third of them are in the SEI 2-hour model. About 10% of them are parent withdrawn. About 2% are in the newcomer model, and all of the other models are not as widely used, and those make up about 1% of the program participation. I also want to point out that our team releases an enrollment data set, an October 1 enrollment file that is available on our webpage under the data section. In that October 1 enrollment file this year, we have introduced a new tab, and that tab is called County by Subgroup. And if you look in the County by Subgroup tab and you total up all of the EL students, you can see that there are about 86,000 EL students identified in that October 1 file. So looking now at that EL need identifier, like I said, about 86,000 currently participating in programs, but I can see that about 11% of them do not have an EL need identified. I can also see that about 2 of them have an incorrect EL need. So, for example, they might be enrolled in a program, but their EL need says that they are not. And this leaves about 87% who have proper EL need identification. So historically, in the calculation of our components, and when we identify who subgroups are, such as the EL subgroup, that EL need identifier is the way that we identify who the EL students are for these subgroups. So this identifier is very important for accountability. So to summarize what I've talked about so far, EL need identification is still possible in the absence of a proper EL need identifier, but there could be impacts to the EL component calculation if the EL need identifier is incorrect. Reassessments are still ongoing, as well as AZM2 tests, so we don't have all of our data together yet at this point. We will have that at the end of July. Very few students who were in a program last year are not in a program this year. About 19,000 of the EL students this year are new, regardless of whether or not they have a placement test. And the SEI pullout model is the most common program type that is being used in the current year. So now I'm going to switch to showing you some graphs. I have a lot of graphs to show you, and I'm going to start with showing you graphs of the program enrollment counts and explain what these graphs mean. This first graph is showing us total EL program participation. Now, there are some duplicates. If students switch programs, then they might be counted twice. So there is a little bit of margin of error, you might say. So let's orient you to this graph. First, I want you to start with looking in that bottom left-hand corner where it says week 0. Now, week 0 means August 1st. That was how I did my analysis. So you can see on August 1st, there are no students participating, but then over the course of that first 4 to 5 weeks of school, all of the EL students get enrolled into these programs, and then the graph shows that big jump in total enrollments. And then over the course of the year, there are a few students added here and there, but essentially that total enrollment count stays pretty steady. I also want to point out that we have 3 lines on this graph. It's a little challenging to see where those 3 lines are because 2 of them are very tightly overlapped. But we have a green line that shows 2019. We have an orange line that shows 2020, and we have a blue line that shows 2021. So if you were to identify that green line and then look at the change that we see in the orange line, so that would be from 2019 to 2020. Typically what we would see is about a 1 to 2% increase in the total EL program participation from one year to the next. And this is because of population growth and migration patterns, et cetera. So the total number increases year over year. But in the current year, 2021, which is the blue line, we are not seeing quite as many total students enrolled in schools this year. There is a very slight decline at this point. And then we have a slight decline in the total number of EL program participants. And so those population growth that we would typically see is not being reflected in the current year. And that means that the 2021 total counts are in line with what they were in 2019. So looking next at parent withdrawal counts. Now this shows a little bit better what those changes are year over year because those lines are separated. So if you look at 2019 compared to 2020, you can see that parent withdrawal counts increase each year. And typically what we have is maybe 11 or 12% of our EL students are parent withdrawn. In the current year, we not only see that population growth, as I mentioned a minute ago, but we also have a slightly lower percentage of overall EL students who are parent withdrawn. So this year it's about 10%, whereas normally it's 11% or a little more than that. So parent withdrawn appears to be a smaller amount overall in the current year. Next, we look at the SEI 2-hour model. Now you can see very clearly that in 2019, the number of students who participated in the 2-hour model was at the bottom of the graph. It was very low. And that's because the 2-hour model was not a widely used model in 2019 like it was in 2020. In 2020, as Laura had mentioned earlier, we had some legislative changes, and that led to larger increase in students participating in a 2-hour model. It was the predominant model last year. In the current year, as I had mentioned, about a third of our students are participating in a 2-hour model. It is not the predominant model currently being used. Here we see the SEI newcomer model. And so this is a new model in 2021, so I don't have comparison data from other years, but I just wanted you to see, even though this is a lesser used model than some of the others, we have, like I said, about 2% of students participating in this model. So that count is just under 1,600 students have participated in this model at some point throughout the year. Also, the SEI pullout model. This model is also a new model that is introduced this year, so I don't have comparison data for this model type either. But I did mention that over half of the students are participating in this model type, so you can see that the total number is just under 50,000. Total students have participated in this model at some point throughout the year. So now I'm going to switch gears a little bit, and I'm going to talk about school mobility and how this can relate to accountability. So first, I want to start off by talking about attendance or enrollment in a single school. What this means is that when I look at the data from the very beginning of the school year through March 31st, or just after spring break, I can see the percentage of students who are enrolled in only one school throughout the year. Now, the best way I think to look at this graph is to orient yourself with where it says 2020 at the bottom, on that bottom axis of the graph. Look at 2020 and then move your eyes up to where that orange line is. These are the non-EL students. So if you look at 2020 and then move your eyes to where that line is at 2021, you can see that for non-EL students, there is a decline in the total percent of students who are enrolled in only one school. You can also see that for EL students, more of them are staying within a single school than their non-EL counterparts, but we can see that the percentage for the EL students is declining as well. So what I'm getting at here is that we are seeing trends towards higher mobility within schools. So to go a little bit deeper on this topic, let's look at enrollments in dual schools. What this means is that students are enrolled in two different schools at the same time with some degree of overlap. So it might be a day, it might be a week, it might be a month, or it might be the entire school year. But students are enrolled in two different schools at the same time. And you can see what the trends are over the last 5 years. If we look at the orange line for the non-EL students and we look at 2020 to 2021, there's a little bit of a decrease in the percent of non-EL students who are dually enrolled. But if we look at the EL students in the blue line, we can see that the percent of EL students who are attending two schools at the same time is increasing, and it has been since about 2018. And I also want to point out, when we're looking at this graph, that if you look at the far right-hand side where it says 2021 and you look at the EL data, that blue line, it says that about 11% of the EL students are enrolled in 2 schools at the same time. Now keep that in mind when I go on to this next graph. This is looking at multiple school attendance. So what that means is that they stopped attending one school and there was a little bit of a gap, whether it's a day, a week, or a month, or whatever. They switched schools. So we can see very clearly that that blue line for EL students is pretty steady over time. But if we look at the percentage for that blue line, especially in 2021, it's about 16%. And when we were looking at the dual enrollments, it was about 11%. So even though it's a pretty steady line for that blue EL line of students, it's about 16%, which means that we have more of them attending multiple schools than we have in dual schools. And if we look at the orange line for non-EL students, you can see very clearly that there was a big jump from 2020 to 2021. So for that orange line in 2020, it was about 15%. And then in 2021, it jumps up past 20%. So we're talking about a 5% increase in school mobility for non-EL students. And if you think about the total population of students across the state, 5% is a pretty big number. Next, we are looking at withdrawals to attend another school. This is called a W-1 withdrawal. If you're not familiar with that, they have withdrawn from one school with the intention of attending another school within the state. And we can see here that the blue line for EL students is down at the bottom. And we can see that the orange line really jumps up in 2021. So what this means is that non-EL students have had a pretty decent increase in the number of students who have withdrawn to attend another school. So this is a reflection of what we saw in the prior slide. We are seeing more mobility, particularly with the non-EL students. This next slide is especially interesting to me. These are withdrawals due to non-attendance. This is called a W-4 withdrawal, if you're not familiar. So it either means that they were withdrawn from the school because they had 10 or more days of non-attendance, or because they have left the school and there's no evidence that they have enrolled somewhere else. So the way I look at it is they kind of disappeared. And what's interesting to me is that the blue line for the EL students has really jumped up from 2020 to 2021. Typically, the EL students are not withdrawing with a W-4 at the same rate as non-ELs. But in this past year, this current year, this number has not only increased sharply, but it has surpassed the percentage for non-ELs. Now, if you look at the left-hand side of this graph and you look at those percents, you can see that these percents are pretty small. If we're focused on the blue line, we can see that from 2020 to 2021, the percentage of students who are withdrawn due to non-attendance has jumped up from about 1% to about 2.75%. So overall, in the total population of EL students, that's not a large number. However, we are seeing that it has more than doubled what it was last year. And I think that this is noticeable. And this last graph I'm going to show you is looking at students who are withdrawn to attend homeschool. We have two graphs here. The one on the left-hand side shows the percent of students who have withdrawn to attend homeschool. And on the right-hand side, we have the percent of those students who have returned to the classroom within the same year. So looking again at that left-hand graph, we can see that the blue line, the EL students, is along the bottom and it's pretty flat. And what this means is that EL students are not very likely to withdraw to attend homeschool. When we compare that with the orange line on the left-hand side, we can see that non-EL students are more likely in general to withdraw for homeschool. But we can see that from 2020 to 2021, there was also a sharp increase here. And what this means is that even though the percentage of total students is less than 1% of the population, it has tripled. The amount of homeschoolers who are non-ELs has tripled from last year, and that's pretty remarkable. So looking then at the right-hand graph, we're looking at the percentage of these students who had left for homeschool who returned to the classroom. And right away we can see that the blue line is above the orange one. And what that means is that if an EL student leaves to attend homeschool, they are much more likely to return to the classroom than their non-EL counterparts. Okay? So to summarize these mobility trends that I've just been showing you, single school attendance is trending down for all students over time. Even though dual attendance is up for ELs, they are more likely to switch schools than to attend two schools simultaneously. Those W1 withdrawals, which was a withdrawal to attend another school in the state, those are lower for ELs than non-ELs. Those W4 withdrawals, which are the withdrawals due to non-attendance, are slightly higher for ELs overall, but there has been a very sharp increase in the number of W4s for EL students, much more so than for their non-EL counterparts. Also, ELs are less likely to withdraw to attend homeschool, but when they do, they are more likely to return to the classroom. And what all of this mobility is getting to is the fact that it will affect the FAE status. If you're not familiar with this term, a FAE student is one who has been there for the full academic year. That means they have spent the majority of their school year within one school. So if mobility increases, then the number of FAE students decreases. And this has an impact on our calculations. So we're not going to have time to go into discussion about these today, but I want to post some questions so that you can share your thoughts and ideas in the chat for the other, your peers to see what it's been like for you. So have you seen these same kind of mobility trends in your school? What thoughts do you have about why these trends are happening, why they're changing over time, what has happened in the current year, just kind of a reflection on what is happening. And finally, do you have any, or have you noticed that the full academic year students have declined? Have you seen mobility that is affecting the number of FAE students within your school? So please take some time to share if you have any thoughts on these, and I will go back and read through those at the end. So now I'm going to switch and talk about AZELA assessments and the calculations for accountability. And I am referring to state and federal accountability. So as I mentioned, the reassessment window for AZELA has been extended this year. It goes until May 21st. And we will be using these reassessments for the calculation of the EL component for state and federal accountability this year. The placement and reassessment data will be available to us at the very end of July. As Audra had mentioned, the field test has been postponed until the fall, but the accountability team had no intention of using those field tests for accountability purposes this year anyway, so that's not going to be an impact for us. I do want to mention for the first time that because of legislation, we will be calculating all of the components, but we will not be issuing letter grades this year. And I will say that again later. So looking at the AZELA assessments for the current year, If we're looking first at placement tests, if we're taking into consideration the number of tests that have been completed as well as the number of placement tests that might be in progress, there are more than 20,000 placement tests this year. If we compare that to last year there were about 36,000. So if we're comparing those two data points, we could say that approximately 55% of the placement tests last year were also taken this year. So we're about 55% of where we were before. And that's pretty remarkable considering the conditions within schools and on campuses throughout the school year. When we look at reassessments, again, I've taken into consideration not only the ones that were completed, as Audra had mentioned earlier, but also taking into consideration the number of reassessments that are in progress. We are somewhere around 75,000 tests. Last year, we were at 85,000. So that means we are approximately about 88% of the reassessment count that we had last year. And this is incredible. I just want to give you credit for all of your hard work in getting those reassessments taken. And I think this is incredible. I did mention that last year we only had 95% of AZELA reassessments taken. So in an ideal world, we would surpass that number this year. So fingers crossed we could get past that point. So the EL calculations for state and federal accountability. The EL component that I calculate requires that that each student has two AZELA score results. The first one establishes a starting point for their performance level, and the second one determines how much the student has grown from that starting point and whether or not proficiency has been achieved. In a nutshell, this is how the calculation functions. Historically, the way that we have calculated it, according to the business rules, if the student was missing a placement test or that placement test was not within a specific time frame, then that student would not be pulled into accountability because their starting point was not determinable for that current school year. Also, in the absence of a reassessment test, students would not be included in the component calculation because we would not have that endpoint for that student to be able to determine how much growth or whether or not they've achieved proficiency. Now this year, with all of the testing conditions that have taken place, the State Board of Education and the technical advisory groups are still in discussion about whether or not we should change the business rules in some way so that we can include more students, even if they don't meet the criteria that we had in place previously. So at this point, they are awaiting more impact data so that they can make a decision as to whether or not the business rules need to change for this component. So looking at the implications, again, for state and federal accountability, I have mentioned several different data points that will have an impact or potentially have an impact on the total number of students who will come into our calculations. The first of these potential implications comes from testing circumstances. The second one comes from the total number of students who are full academic year, or FAE. We could potentially see a reduction in the number of students eligible for calculation.
Awesome, Liz. I was kind of stressing out, and that makes me feel so much better. Thank you.
Very impactful this year because we use that EL need identifier as our primary means of identifying who the EL students are. So I want to take a second moment to just say, if you get a chance to go into your data, into your 73 report, and look again at who your students are in that report, whether or not they have an EL need identified and whether or not that is correct. So combined, all of these different data points could potentially be affected in the current year. And I mentioned that ideally we would have at least 95% of all of our students tested. And if or where this is not achieved, we are going to be doing follow-up studies to determine what that impact is on accountability. So for example, one of the things that we might be looking at are what are the changes to the statewide averages, in this case for EL proficiency or for EL growth. Also, we will be looking at changes to school eligibility. So what I mean by this is, for our indicators, your school needs to have at least 10 FAE students in order to be eligible for those points. If your school typically had more than 10 FAE students, but this year they don't, we will be looking at that. We will be looking at how many schools have become ineligible this year because they didn't have the FAE counts that they ordinarily might have had last year. And as another example, we will be looking at changes to essentially the overall points that schools receive. So if there are shifts in the distribution of points, because of all of these implications that I've mentioned, we will be looking at what that shift is and how many schools are being impacted in their points received. So I want to just take a second to make this announcement. It's related to the things that I'm talking about, but this is just a great opportunity for me to mention it to you for the first time. And you will see this announcement in our newsletter, the accountability newsletter, which is called The Grader, and that is available on our webpage as well if you don't receive it by email. The Grader will be mentioning this announcement, and the assessments team will also be making these announcements. So what this says is that the EL amendment application that is typically operational is no longer going to be used. It is going to be retired this year. So the EL amendment application is going to be retired. However, the EL reason application is still going to be operational. It is still going to be used. So I'm just going to take a pause for a few seconds and let you take a chance to look over this announcement, and then I will make my concluding remarks. Okay, so like I said, you will be seeing this announcement again. So I'm going to move forward now. And these are my final words, kind of summarizing everything that I've talked about so far. Even though EL students may be identified in various ways in our data marts, there are certain business rules for students to be included in our calculations. And those rules may be revisited by the advisory groups and the state board. Mobility, student mobility, testing circumstances, and potentially changes in program participation can and probably will in some way impact the results of the EL component that we calculate this year versus the way that those results would look in other years. Letter grades will not be issued, but components are going to be calculated as usual. And this is part of that Senate Bill 1178, if you want to follow up and read more about that. It was signed by the governor. In addition to this, we have a federal waiver for non-identification of school support. And what that means is that we are not going to be identifying schools as CSI, TSI, or ATSI this year, but we will be calculating those federal components every year. And we will be calculating them this year as well. And we will be taking all of this data and reporting it back to you at the schools. And we will do that in the usual manner. So if you have access to ADE Connect to see your data there, you will see what we typically produce and reflect back to you. If you don't have access to that, or if you're interested in other ways of looking at the data, the public reports are going to be available this year as well. And finally, as part of that Senate Bill 1178 that the governor has signed, he has required that we also do studies on the academic impact that results from COVID. So you might have heard the term learning loss, studies related to learning loss. That is a term that is used across the nation. I prefer the term academic impact. We will be looking at the academic impact in all of our data, and we will start doing that immediately after all of the data is received at the end of July. And so I want to make my final reminder that you go in and check your data for accuracy. So not only that 73 report, which I've mentioned a couple of times, that EL need indicator is very important to us, but also Mickey had talked about integrity failures. Those integrity failures are very important to accountability, because if your data has not passed integrity, then that potentially could keep your students' data out of your static file. If you're not aware of what that static file is, it's a very large data set that we put together for each of the schools, and we use that static file for our calculations. So even though there are a lot of different types of integrity errors, that just means there are a lot more opportunities for students to be kicked out of the static file. And that means they're not going to get a growth score. That means they're not going to be included in proficiency calculations. That means that they're not going to be included in the EL component. So I want to ask you, please go in and check your data for integrity errors. If you need assistance with that, please talk to your data team, please talk to your IT personnel, and check those data points so that we can more accurately reflect back to you what the data is truly saying, okay? So that's it for me. I am going to stop sharing now and see if we have any questions. And I think we have, oh gosh, less than a minute.
We do. Alexa, stop. Sorry
so I will be taking these questions and saving them, reviewing them, sharing them with my team, and we will address any frequently asked questions in our Grader newsletter. So I can just give you some comfort that I will be noticing all of these comments that you shared today. And thank you for having me.
Great, thank you, Kim. We appreciate you sharing that information with us. This was great.